is Becky Hall. I'm the Executive Director here at the Nevada Science Center. I'm here with our Director of Research, Dr. Josh Bondi, and today he'll be talking to you about the Ice Age or the Pleistocene here in Las Vegas. So the Nevada Science Center is located in Henderson, Nevada, which is right in Las Vegas Valley on the south side of the valley. And we're located here where we have our research lab, our small museum, and our little rock shop. So we do outreach, and we also have classes and other activities. So if you're ever in town, head down to the Nevada Science Center and see what we got here to show you. So with that, I'll let Dr. Bondi share with you the Ice Age.
Thank you, Becky. So yes, so we're talking about the Ice Age today. So we're here in Southern Nevada, which for those of you who maybe are not in the United States, it's morning time here. We're one state to the east of California, and we're on the very southern end of the state of Nevada. So about 3.5, 4 hours from Los Angeles, depending on traffic. So we're going to be talking about the Ice Age. What are the Ice Ages? So that's the Pleistocene epoch for if you're a geologist or if you're a scientist. So that spans roughly from about 2.4 million years ago to 10,000 years ago. So Southern Nevada, most people, if you're familiar with the state, it's the driest state in the United States. So here in Southern Nevada, we get about 4 inches of rain a year, which is not that much. And when it dumps really quick, and then there's flash floods, and then it's all done. And then it's just really hot the rest of the year. That's not the way it was over 10,000 years ago. Over 10,000 years ago, there was a mile of ice sitting on top of Canada. So with a mile of ice sitting on top of Canada, all those wet air masses that make Seattle and Portland kind of dreary and foggy and wet were deflected to the south. And so places like San Francisco, Reno, Salt Lake City, those were the places that got all the fog and all the rain. And so instead of glaciers, we didn't actually have great big glaciers in Nevada. There were a couple of little glaciers up in the high parts of the mountains, but in Nevada, we got big lakes. So all that rain that dumps in the Pacific Northwest today dumped in Nevada and filled up all of our valleys with these great big lake basins. And so those lakes supported big ecosystems of big animals. So some of the big animals, especially here in Southern Nevada, so in the Las Vegas Valley, a diverse group of animals. We have things like camels, 2 species of bison, 2 species of horses, llamas were roaming across this area, and probably the animal we find the most of are Colombian mammoths. So Colombian mammoths are the big cousins of the woolly mammoth. Our toys aren't quite to scale, but woolly mammoths we know have hair because they lived in places like around the Great Lakes in the northeastern part of the United States. And so they were shaggy because they needed the fur because they lived close to the glaciers. Colombian mammoths were like giant elephants because they are giant elephants. And so these great big elephants may or may not have had hair. Their closest living relatives are Asian elephants. And so these are what we find the most of. So whereas a woolly mammoth probably got to about 12 feet tall at the shoulder, maybe the same size as a modern Asian elephant, Colombian elephants got to about 18 feet tall at the shoulder. So they were the largest of the elephant species during the Ice Ages. That brings us to another point. Maybe you've heard the name Mastodon. So mastodons were actually cousins of mammoths and elephants. So mastodons have a longer history in North America, going back to about 23 million years ago, and they also go extinct about 10,000 years ago. So mastodons have a completely different type of tooth. So these are some 3D prints courtesy of Dr. Bernard Means at the Virtual Curation Lab at Virginia Commonwealth University. So they have big lumpy teeth like this, whereas a mammoth or an elephant has flatter teeth like this. So mastodons were chomping on leaves and things like that and shrubs, whereas elephants and mammoths were chomping on grass. So these are specialized teeth. And this is just one tooth from a Colombian mammoth. These are specialized teeth for grinding up grass. So the teeth would move back and forth across these big enamel plates.
So that's the real.
So what's that?
That was the real fossil.
Yeah, this is the real thing. So this is one tooth, and the way it would fit in the mouth would be, and it would grow forward like that. And then they would shed out the worn out teeth out of the front of their mouth. So mammoths, elephants live to about 65 years old when they run out of these enamel plates. And they actually die of starvation at around 60 or 65 years old, which is sad, but they live full life, right? All right, some other animals that we have fossils of here from Southern Nevada during the Ice Ages. This is a shin bone from a bison. So this is one bone And by comparison, this is a modern cow bone. So if you've ever seen a cow just out in the field, you can see how much bigger the bison, Ice Age bison were. So the two species of Ice Age bison, there was Bison antiquus, which looks like the modern bison, but except bigger. And then Bison latifrons, which was the Texas longhorn bison, and the largest species of bison that ever existed in North America. So the latifrons would have been about 9 feet tall at the shoulder with a spread of horns like that. So I mentioned camels. So this is one hand bone from Camelops histernus, which is the old day camel. So this is a camel that probably would have stood about 10 feet tall at the shoulder. So I'm 6'4" tall. And so this hand bone, this is just one bone of the foot or the hand, is longer than my entire forearm. And if we put it next to the bison bone or the cow bone, its hand's as long as the shin of these enormous animals. So showing just how stilt-legged and how tall this animal would have been. And these things are the second most common animals that we have in the Ice Age of Southern Nevada. So herds of camels making their way across Southern Nevada just 10,000 years ago. This is actually one of their teeth. And so these things were probably eating shrubs, so the desert shrubs. Southern Nevada was never super lush. And so during the ice ages, even though it was wetter and cooler, it was still a desert. And so these camels, just like modern camels, were walking across the desert in herds and chomping on the shrubs across the landscape. And I mentioned horses. So this is a 3D print, again, courtesy of Dr. Bernard Meads, of an Ice Age horse that lived here in the Mojave Desert, again, about 10,000 years ago. So who has eaten all these animals? So in Southern Nevada and in Northern Nevada as well, we have found evidence of saber-toothed cats, American lions, and American cheetahs. It turns out cheetahs are actually just specialized mountain lions, immigrated from North America to the Old World. And now, so if you look at a cheetah on a nature special, just think of a mountain lion. So they're actually cousin species. One last one is actually the most common carnivore in the Ice Age of North America, which is the direwolf. So this used to be known as Canis dirus, or the cousin of gray wolves. But some recent DNA studies from specimens from Alaska, it turns out this thing is more closely related to foxes. And so it's an instance of what we call convergent evolution. So to fill the same ecological niche that gray wolves filled in the Old World, these foxes evolved to look almost identical to gray wolves, except bigger. So they're about 50 pounds bigger than a gray wolf. And so this is a 3D print of a direwolf skull from Rancho La Brea. And if we turn this, it just looks like a dog skull, right? Maybe you've seen a dog skull in your teaching collections or maybe out in the desert. But if you turn this thing over, these great big cheek teeth are what set a direwolf apart from a gray wolf. So these big cheek teeth have been interpreted or hypothesized to be an adaptation for crunching on bones of great big animals, like maybe big bison or great big camels. So in 2011, we found the very first bone of a direwolf from the entire state of Nevada. Again, even though this is the most common carnivore from North America during the Ice Age, no specimens were known from the entire state of Nevada until this specimen was discovered. And so what you're looking at, it doesn't look all that impressive, but it's actually this bone right here. So part of the knuckle. And it's big enough and of the right shape. It's from a great big dog, and the only great big dogs during this period of time in Southern Nevada would have been direwolves. So some other weird animals that were walking around Southern Nevada during this period of time. We have 2 species of giant ground sloths. So maybe you've heard of a giant ground sloth, maybe you haven't. So they are the cousins of modern tree sloths. They had a metabolism similar to a tree sloth, so they were not moving very quickly, but they were the size of bears. And so these things, 2 species were found here in Southern Nevada in Gypsum Cave and at the Tule Springs fossil beds. And it turns out giant ground sloths really like to go poop in caves. And so here in Southern Nevada and over in the Grand Canyon, we find what are called sloth dung caves, which are caves completely filled up with mummified sloth poop. So this is a 3D print. Our friend, again, Dr. Bernard Meads, went to the collections of the Smithsonian and 3D scanned a piece of sloth poop. And so scientists, not me, have picked apart the sloth poop to see what they ate, because Just like when you eat, things pass through your system and sometimes they're identifiable and sometimes they're not. But it turns out that these sloths really liked flowers of yucca plants. If you're from Nevada and you've seen the orange flowers on the sides of the roads, those are called globe mallow. That was also a really favorite of these giant ground sloths, apparently. And they liked agave as well. So the sloths living here in southern Nevada ate all the same plants that you still see on the landscape today. All right, so we wanted to show off our historical artifact as well.
Sure. Let's see.
So this is not a story about Nevada, but because it's in our collection, it's about the Ice Age. We're going to talk about it anyways because it's kind of cool. So this is a print that was donated by the Antique Florists, which are our neighbors across the street here in Henderson, downtown Henderson. So this is a print from the 1910 San Francisco Chronicle. Number one, it's in color, which is really unique for this period of time, but it's the story of the discovery of the Rancho La Brea tar pits. So where this direwolf came from, again, if you have a chance to visit the Rancho La Brea, the Page Museum at the Rancho La Brea tar pits, an amazing museum, and they have an entire wall of direwolf skulls. So all the Ice Age fossils that we find here in southern Nevada are the same age as the Rancho La Brea tar pits. It's just over a lot bigger area. And it's maybe important to note, we find Ice Age fossils from across the state of Nevada. So we find there's been a lot of fossils found around the city of Lovelock in northern Nevada. The only Ice Age mastodon that's ever been found in the state of Nevada. So again, one of these elephants had the teeth more similar to ours than modern elephants, was found near Elko in the northeastern part of the state. So Nevada actually has a really rich Ice Age fossil history. And one of the really cool things that I think about this is that I'm Native American, so my tribe, the Newet, or the Western Shoshone, is found across the state of Nevada, along with our cousins, the New and the Numu, who are the northern and the southern Pipes and the Washoe around Reno. But our ancestors, humans, actually saw these animals walking across the landscape and actually interacted with them. So I think that's a really cool part of this story as well. So Ralph, with that, I'll shoot it to you for questions.
That is incredible because that was literally one of the questions I just got from the students. If humans interacted with any of these animals, can you by any chance kind of elaborate on that? Like how do they interact with these animals?
Yeah, you bet. So the earliest evidence that we have of people in North America, direct evidence, dates to about 14,000-year-old petroglyphs found near Pyramid Lake around just north of Reno. There's some new studies that are coming out from New Mexico that maybe people hear a little bit earlier than that, but the earliest uncontroversial evidence of people in North America is about 14,000 years ago. These animals don't go extinct until about 10,000, 9,000 years ago. So there's a whole backstory about the fossils and the archaeology of southern Nevada that we don't really have time for today, but suffice it to say, there have been mammoth falls or mammoth kill sites that have been found in Arizona and New Mexico, where mammoths were actually butchered, and there's evidence of butcher marks on the bones. In southern Nevada, the only evidence that we have of people interacting with the big animals is that there's a camel bone that was found in the north part of the Las Vegas Valley that actually has knife marks on it. And so somebody was actually butchering one of these camels, and it was preserved in the spring. So people did interact with these things; they were hunting them, just like people do today.
That is absolutely fascinating. And that touches on, we had a question from a student in Italy, and they wanted to know if there was a specific scientific name for the North American camel.
So this species of camel, so camels actually originate in North America about 50 million years ago, and most of their evolutionary run is in North America before they go to the Old World. So that's a long answer to a short question. The species name of this camel is Camelops hesternus, which just means old world or old days camel. I should mention that all of the fossils, the real fossils that we have on our table here today, are from the collections of the Nevada State Museum in Carson City, even though they were excavated here in the Las Vegas Valley.
Interesting. And speaking of the Las Vegas Valley in southern Nevada, there's a student here in Nevada, and they want to know, is there any particular place that you guys would recommend to search for fossils in southern Nevada?
So in order to collect a fossil, you have to have a permit. And so where all these fossils came from was previously administered by the Bureau of Land Management. It's now currently administered by the National Park Service at Tule Springs Fossil Beds National Monument and at Ice Age Fossil State Park by the state. So you need to have a permit in order to collect fossils. But if you want to see fossils in the ground, Ice Age Fossil State Park is getting ready to open their visitor center on the north end of the Las Vegas Valley soon. And they have trails and they have interpretive rangers that can take you out and you can actually see where these Ice Age fossils were excavated. And if you're lucky, maybe even some fossils in the ground.
That's wonderful. So we have a couple of questions that are related to the environment back then, and they more or less, to sum it up, they want to know, how were the tar pits made over time?
All right, so the difference between Las Vegas and the tar pits in Los Angeles, here in Las Vegas, these were marshlands, and so faults controlled where groundwater bubbled up to the surface. And just like water animals, they come to the water holes to drink, and life runs its course. Animals live and die around water holes. Rancho La Brea is different because there's it's 15 to 8 million year old sea creatures been squished into petroleum. And that petroleum bubbles up to the surface right on Wilshire Boulevard, which is downtown Los Angeles. If you look at historical photographs of downtown Los Angeles, it's all oil derricks. And so it's where an oil reservoir actually bubbles up to the surface. And one of the interesting things is that the water would pond on the surface of the oil in the area of Rancho La Brea. So say a mammoth would come in, try to get a sip of water, get stuck in the tar. So if that mammoth's stuck in the tar, the pack of direwolves comes along, oh look, a free meal. And so they jump on the mammoth to go eat it, they get stuck in the tar. The vulture comes by and says, hey, a bunch of dead animals, I'm gonna go eat the free meal, they get stuck in the tar. A couple years later, a camel comes stomp along, gets stuck in the tar. And then the same thing just happens and happens and happens. So one of the big differences between Las Vegas and the tar pits is that there's a lot more carnivores than there should be in an ecosystem because the carnivores kept coming in and getting stuck in the tar. And one of the really, I think, is kind of an interesting side story to the tar pits is that somebody studied the age and the sex of the American lions from the tar pits. And it turns out all the lions that were stuck in the Rancho La Brea tar pits were teenage boys. So that seems to transcend species. Teenage boys do stupid things.
And which brings us to our next point: be careful where you go to eat lunch, right?
Right.
So we have a lot of questions coming in through the chat, so I'm going to kind of fire off as many as we can because we know we have you for a little bit longer. But the students want to know, can you ballpark around how many fossils you guys have over at the Nevada Science Center on Water Street?
The Ice Age fossils, we have about a dozen, and again, about half of them are on loan from the Nevada State Museum. I should mention, all the fossils that we collect through the Nevada Science Center technically go to the Nevada State Museum, and then they loan them back to us for exhibit. So about a dozen Ice Age fossils, and all in all, from all of our projects, we probably have about 100 fossils from various time periods.
So we have a double question. This is about dire wolves, and the first question is do they know about how big the dire wolves got? And the second question was, are the dire wolves at all related to hyenas?
So the first question, dire wolves, by their biggest estimate, the biggest male dire wolf probably got to about 175 pounds. So we actually have a St. Bernard at home, which is about that same size. So if you think of a St. Bernard, there were packs of mean St. Bernards running around North America until about 10,000 years ago. And then the second question, whether or not direwolves are related to hyenas. Hyenas are actually more closely related to cats than they are to dogs. And so they're actually completely distantly related groups of carnivorous animals. So direwolves, they fill a similar ecological niche as hyenas because we didn't have hyenas.
So there, you heard it there first. So we have and again, I have a number of questions from kids wanting to know about finding bones on their own, which again, you shouldn't, there's a whole legality thing there. If they find animal bones on their own, what should they do?
So if you are out on a hike and you find a bone that you think is a fossil, number one, do not pick it up. So as scientists, when we go out there and we excavate fossils, the rocks that those fossils are found in tell us a lot about the environment. It tells us about the time period. If you pick up that fossil, we lose a whole bunch of information. So what you should do if you find a fossil when you're out on a hike or if you're just poking around your backyard, take a picture and a GPS and send it to either us at the Science Center or your local museum, and then they'll be able to figure it out. And if you work through us at the Science Center or most museums, if you find something really cool, they'll include you in the research part of it. So you get to actually see the whole research process.
That's super interesting. That would be awesome to have your name associated with that. And we'll have their website embedded in this video. So and this will be sent to everyone who's on the call. So one of the questions that I'm getting this quite a bit, and they want to know, can you sum up, do they have any idea how all these animals went extinct?
I'm sorry, what was that?
They wanted to know how these animals got extinct. Would you by chance be able to elaborate on that?
Yeah, of course. So how did all these amazing animals go extinct? There's classically been two hypotheses. So the first is that early North Americans came in and hunted them all to extinction, which doesn't really make sense, because if you're a hunter or if you're a part of a culture that lives off the land, you know better than to kill off all your food, because that just doesn't really make sense. The other hypothesis classically has been climate change. So as the climate warmed up, the grasses began to spread and woodlands began to go away, and all these great big lakes dried up, but maybe that happened too quickly for the animals to adapt. And then there's a third hypothesis that modern bison came over and like a plague of locusts ate all the food. In actuality, it was probably a combination of all three. So a new competitor, a new predator, and things changing. It was just a whole lot of stress on the ecosystems, and a lot of the big animals were the first to go because they required the most nutrients. That's probably the closer to actuality.
That's all this stuff is really fascinating. And before we let you go, can you by any chance touch on how you and Becky got interested in paleontology?
So me personally, how did I become interested in paleontology? I grew up on my family farm up in Fallon, Nevada, which is about an hour east of Reno. And I loved being outdoors. I loved hiking. I loved camping. I was a dinosaur nerd growing up, and my parents really fostered that. And so they took me and my brother to museums. And so it was actually a museum experience that inspired me to pursue a career in paleontology and go on and get my PhD in geology in order to teach people all about our cool prehistory.
That's so wonderful. And can you guys, by any chance, before we let you go, can you tell us of any exciting stuff that's on the horizon with the Nevada Science Center?
So we're going to be doing some Earth Day activities. Some that are actually centered around work that was done at the Stewart Boarding School, which is where they sent Indigenous kids to a boarding school till the 1980s. But the kids and some of the mentors there put together some work on native plants and their uses. So we're going to actually be doing some programming around that over Earth Day. And then we have some more virtual field trips coming your way and Fossil Fridays.
Absolutely. And check out the Nevada Science Center online. Again, we'll have that website embedded in the video, and all this recording will be shared out probably early next week. And before we let you go, we can't thank you and Becky enough for connecting all of these students around the world. I'm going to let everyone unmute and say thank you to Josh and Becky for such a special event. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.